Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Recently, I had cause to reflect on how lucky I've been in a professional sense over the last couple of years. Finding a community of readers and writers through this podcast who share my passion for Australian fiction has been joyful, to say the least. And in these unusual times, the bonds that we share have never been more evident. But as a writer myself, this podcast has also given me the opportunity to connect with a fabulous cast of Australian authors, to learn from them and keep the flame of my own aspirations alive through their words of encouragement and insight. So the prospect of speaking with my next guest was exciting on a number of levels. She is a Melbourne-based writer, reviewer, agent, book blogger and youth literature advocate. In 2017, she edited and contributed to an anthology of Australian young adult stories inspired by the LoveOZYA movement, for which she has been a passionate proponent. That book, Begin, End, Begin, won the 2018 ABIA Book of the Year Award for Children 13+, and was shortlisted for the 2018 Gold Inky Awards. This week, Hachette will release her debut novel through their imprint LoveOZYA Children's Books, a middle-grade coming-of-age story that I found to be utterly compelling and beautifully written. The novel is called The Year the Maps Changed, and I'm delighted to welcome author Danielle Binks to the podcast today. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and for that beautiful introduction. I very much appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I wanted to say congratulations on the publication of your debut novel. How very exciting.
Thank you so much. I'm finding I am getting excited, even though it's a very different release, but I've got really nothing to compare it to apart from the LoveOZYA anthology, which was already its own beast because it was me and 9 other people. So I'm finding that this is a very different release from an anthology. I'm feeling a little bit lonely without the 9 others from the LoveOZYA anthology, and then on top of COVID isolation. So it's a very different launch, but I am assured that it is a thing that exists in the world. You have read it, which is wonderful proof for me that it's going to be read by people, even though I can't see the people. That's amazing. So thank you kindly.
Beautiful. I hold it in my hot little hands here, so it's definitely a thing. I have seen it, I have read it, as you've said, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I wanted to ask you, how different is it for you to see your own novel out in the world, or to know that it's out in the world, compared to novels that you sell for authors you represent?
Oh gosh, this is a tricky one. Again, in the year 2020, I haven't seen it out in the world. I had a moment, probably about 2 weeks ago, where it hit me that I wouldn't get to see my book displayed in a bookshop. You know, the front of house display is what it's sometimes called. And I was sort of like, oh, that's something that I hadn't thought about. That has made me a little bit sad. And then, of course, I moved on, and it helped that people were sort of sending me photos of them reading it in their backyards and in various places around their house. And the fact that you're telling me that you're holding a copy and it's a tangible thing that exists is lovely. So it's a little bit different this year, and that was definitely a kind of a moment of grief, but only a fleeting moment of grief, as you know, someone who's put out this artistic thing and it's not quite the way that you pictured it would be out. But the difference between me as an agent hyping books and me as an author hyping books is I think I go through what all creatives do, which is to be a little bit embarrassed about talking about your book and a little bit apologetic that you're taking up space and time talking about it. You know, you always feel a little bit like, I've made this thing, here it is. Sorry if you don't like it. That's kind of just the general impulse of creatives, I feel. But when I'm an agent hyping my authors, I'm loud, I'm proud, I'm shoving it in people's faces, saying you have to read this book. It is incredible. I very much enjoy being the hype person for them.
Yeah.
And I'll do it again when I say it. Just so happened that this year on April 28th, when my book comes out, is also the release date of 2 of my authors,
Oh,
which is
wow.
it is Kay Kerr with Please Don't Hug Me and Anna Whateley with Peter Lyer's Rating Normal. Both of them are LoveOZYA books. Both of them happen to be about neurodiverse protagonists, which is wonderful for We Need Diverse books. They are two very different books, though. I would say Anna's is an LGBT plus story as well, and Keiko's is a story that's dealing with family and grief and coming of age in a big way as well. So that's me. I'm hyping other people. So hi, Anna. Hi, Kay. And with my own book, I do the typical creative neurotic author thing of shrugging my shoulders and saying, I don't know, if you want to read it, you can. I'm sorry if you don't like it. I can assure you that's typical of most creatives. As a society, we don't generally teach kids, perhaps apart from male children, to be proud of themselves and to be a little bit pushy and say, look at this thing I did and celebrate me. We don't really encourage that. So it's a little bit hard twofold as a creative and probably as a woman to want to take up space, and it feels a little bit egotistical to do it, even more so in a time during a pandemic. To say, hey, I know the world is crumbling, but I've written a book, feels really awkward. I'm trying to overcome that, but it is tenfold harder. So,
I suspect you're not alone, but you've created something that is brilliant, amazing, entertaining, enlightening, and for that you should be proud.
Thank you so much. And you know what? That is exactly what I tell my own authors. I say to them, look, the thing that everyone is reaching for during this time of isolation and during this time of great fear, we're all reaching for comforting human stories and storytelling, and we are storytellers, and you should embrace that fact and know that you are. And particularly for Anna and Kay, I've been telling them there are kids out there who need your book, who've never seen themselves in the pages of a book before, and those kids are going to find you during pandemic and even after that as well, because books are magic and they do live on. And these books, particularly for young people, I feel maybe it takes a little bit longer for young adult literature in Australia to find its niche and to find its audience, but then they are forevermore something that exists and that kids can track down and find and hold close to their hearts. I am so comfortable telling other people that it's a lesson I'm learning actively to apply that to my own world and creative self, definitely.
Indeed. So let's get back to your book. I love all kinds of books, but I especially love the ones where you learn something you didn't know before or where you gain insight into a situation you hadn't truly appreciated. And your book is one of those. So for the benefit of listeners, can you tell me a bit more about the book and where your inspiration came from?
Sure. So the book is historic fiction. It is set in 1999. And yes, I will repeat that. It is historic fiction, even though it's set in 1999. And for some of us, let's be honest, for kids, that really truly is history. It's way too long ago. Some weren't even born then. But for lots of us, like me, it feels like it was only about 5 years ago, but it was not. It's historic fiction. It's set on the Mornington Peninsula, and it deals with an event in 1999 which was labelled Operation Safe Haven by John Howard's government, which saw about 4,000 Kosovar Albanian refugees being brought over to Australia and housed at 8 different safe havens in 5 locations around the country, one of which was down here on the Mornington Peninsula at the Point Nepean disused quarantine station, which also feels very relevant to the year 2020 that they housed them in a quarantine station. Basically, my book is about 11 going on 12-year-old Winifred Fred Owen Ritchie, who's already going through a lot of upheaval in her family life. And then this kind of global crisis comes to her back door, and she finds herself developing a friendship with one of the refugees, a pregnant refugee woman, in fact, and her life is forever changed by those events and the way that she, I think, handles a global crisis within her community.
As you say, we learn about a period of Australian history that isn't too distant, and I'm ashamed to admit that it was a chapter that I had forgotten about until I read your book. So I wanted to ask you, why this period and why now?
Why this period is easy. It's because I remembered this happening. I was much like my protagonist, Fred. I was 11 going on 12 in 1999. I've grown up and lived on the Mornington Peninsula my whole life. And I knew about this event that happened kind of close to my back door, much like Fred did. I kind of tucked that knowledge away, didn't overly examine it when I was living through it. And then, in 2016, decided to just unearth that little piece of history. I would also say because around that time, local politicians were talking about getting the quarantine station back up and running in some capacity, perhaps as a refugee centre or more likely as a detention centre. And so a lot of that history was kind of being unearthed, and I decided to investigate it again just for my own curiosity as somebody who is a bit of a history nerd. And I found that 1999 was a bit of a tipping point in Australian history. I found that the events of Operation Safe Haven, which on paper sound like an instance where John Howard, actually working with Ruddock, did some good in the world during a crisis on the other side of it and welcoming refugees to Australia. And it really wasn't an instance where the Australian public were very encouraging of those Kosovar Albanian refugees coming over here, who were mostly Muslim refugees. It sounds like on paper they did the right thing, but of course it's not as black and white as that, because it turns out that John Howard used Operation Safe Haven to lay down the framework for the current refugee policy that we still have, which is denying them permanent resettlement and only giving them temporary protection. So that all came through with Operation Safe Haven and a whole lot of government measures that were designed to kind of curb Australia's outreach in a lot of ways. And I found that it was the events of Operation Safe Haven unfolding in 1999, happening alongside the East Timorese crisis as well. So that was 1999. And then, of course, in August of 2001, you have the Children Overboard affair happening in the Australian media. And then in September 2001, it's 9/11. And I just found those kind of markers of the way Australia still treats refugees and asylum seekers. I could trace it back to 1999 Operation Safe Haven in a lot of ways. And I thought there was something in that of Australia as, in some ways, a young country with a conservative government trying to do the right thing, but ultimately leading us on a path to where we are now, which is treating refugees and asylum seekers absolutely inhumanely. And I thought I wanted to explore that through the eyes of a young girl who is herself coming of age, who is recognizing her role as a global citizen within her own community, but also within the world. I was really drawn to it being historic fiction set in 1999 because, yeah, as you say, we're not in the position, I don't think yet, to be recognizing those kind of recent events as impacting us now. And I think it's important that we do, and that we get kids especially to start thinking about that.
Yeah.
Because I think in children's books, there's a tendency, and much as I love these books and have many favorites, there's a tendency in historic fiction for children to be set in World War I or World War II. Of course, those events do feel much more black and white, given the benefit of history, looking back on them. And I think there's a tendency to only present those instances of war to kids as an explanation for how we got to where we are now. And I think it's time that we start looking at more recent history and looking at ourselves currently a little bit more deeply and seeing the pathways that we took to get to where we are.
Yeah, I agree with you in that Australia's always had such a difficult relationship with our refugee policy. But seeing the issue through children's eyes really helps us cut through the rhetoric, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because kids actually do see the world in black and white, and they are actually really absorbed by right and wrong and the idea of the truth. That, like, because they're taught these things to be black and white. They're taught here's right and wrong, good and bad, good versus evil. And so they kind of have that myopic view of the world for a little while. And of course, they need to realize there are shades of grey. But for a little while there, it's kind of beautiful that it's really easy for them to see what is right and wrong. Even as adults sometimes try to justify bad behavior and bad policy and bad governmental steps, etc., as we're seeing right now with refugee and asylum seeker policy, it's really easy for kids to see what the right path is. I was trying to do that a little bit in the book as well, I think, because there's a few young characters in the book who are kind of clouded by their parents' view of the world, and they're trying to figure out what they think given current events. Yeah. So I was trying to show that kids have this real dedication, I think, to right and wrong, which I think is quite beautiful. And for that little while, I think it's lovely if we lean into that and let them explore what they think of as a moral compass.
The plight of the Kosovar Albanian refugees who were evacuated to Australia under this Operation Safe Haven was an incredibly difficult one, especially since it was only ever intended to be a temporary situation, and most were eventually returned to their war-torn homeland. Nevertheless, you managed to capture the impossibility of their situation and resulting desperation with such sensitivity for your target audience. So I wanted to ask you, what research did you have to do to understand not only the situation from the point of view of the refugees, but also of the Australian communities in which they found themselves in?
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I probably used research as a bit of a crutch for too long. I ended up researching for about 5 years. If I consider that I had the spark for an idea in about 2016, I convinced myself that I had to do a ton of research, because once I realized that I wanted to write historic fiction, I got very scared of misstepping,
Mm.
because obviously historic fiction, you have real life markers that you have to reach for, stuff that really did happen in history. And again, writing for kids, I knew this was all stuff they could go off and research, and that they would. Teachers' notes exist, and they're a really big revealer if you've written anything incorrectly or you've taken something wildly out of context. So I was really kind of hampered, I think, for a little while by my fear that I would get it wrong. So I spent about 5 years researching, and I did things like I traveled out to another location of one of the safe havens was Singleton in New South Wales.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that they had an incredible library there, public library, and they had kept every single newspaper and newsletter article clipping, etc., that they had from that time. So I poured over those during about 2 days of research, photographing everything and documenting it all, because it was a wonderful, wonderful font of knowledge for me. And thank you to those Singleton public librarians who had meticulously kept all those archives. Also because they were really proud of having been a safe haven location during that time. So they had really beautifully kept all of those. Yes, it was artifacts and official documents, but it was also memories for them of a really wonderful time, because they remembered the Kosovo Albanian refugees really warmly and wonderfully. So I got to interview also a few librarians who had been working during that time of Operation Safe Haven and had actually been volunteers at the safe havens. Um, I also managed to chat online to a few Americans who were Kosovo Albanian refugees who then became American citizens. They were part of Operation Provide Refuge, so a slightly different name to Operation Safe Haven.
Mm.
I got to chat to them, and one of them was a teenage boy actually who kind of only vaguely remembered that time because he was quite young when he came over, about 5. But he kind of talked about how much his parents still talk about that time. And in America, they actually did uh, accept more refugees as permanent residents after the fact. Australia only accepted about 400, and many of those are probably contested. So we had a much lower case than America did. And for that reason as well, I found that Kosovo has a real love affair, in particular with Hillary Clinton.
Mm.
They really love her because she was a real spokesperson for them during that time, to the point that there is even a Hillary Clinton clothing store chain in Kosovo
Oh,
which sells pantsuits.
wow.
Yeah, so if you type in Kosovo Hillary Clinton, you'll find that anytime she has visited the country, they've had her stand in front of one of her chain stores that are dedicated to her, of this women's fashion label that sell pantsuits, because they had this real love affair with Hillary Clinton because she was a champion for the Kosovo refugees during Operation Provide Refuge, which is just a little piece of uh, research that didn't make its way into the book because it's not relevant,
Yeah.
and because it's a matter of hindsight. It came a few years after 99. But yeah, so that was something. So I did a lot of research. I did a lot of reading as well, and there's actually some fabulous research papers and everything written by Australians who were volunteers during Operation Safe Haven from various organisations like the Red Cross, etc. I actually got to find quite a few through universities and libraries research papers that were also delving into, like I said, the political framework that changed for Operation Safe Haven deliberately by Howard and Ruddock, and how that has still impacted refugees today. So I did a lot of research, but honestly, like I said, I was using research as a bit of a crutch. So for 5 years, I thought I had to read every middle grade historic book because I had to know where the goalposts were.
Mm.
I had to research, and I didn't do any writing. And it turns out that if you want to write, you have to write. Researching isn't writing, and reading isn't writing. Funnily enough, writing is writing.
Yeah.
So that was how the book actually came about. But I will say, as somebody also who identifies as a pantser, somebody who doesn't actually follow an outline, having done all the historic research really helped me,
Yeah.
because it really gave me the framework of the 12 months I was setting the story during. Once I had that framework, I knew what all the markers were for the refugee story that I had to hit. And then it was a matter of just sitting down and letting my protagonist actually talk to me,
Yeah.
because I'd sort of been strangling them. Oh, that sounds awful. Convincing myself, no, I have to do more research. I've got to do more research. I can't do the story yet until I've got the research. But of course, the story was just bubbling away in the back of my head. For every bit of research I did, I kept thinking about how Fred would react. What could my characters be doing? How would that be inserting into their lives? And I did things like deciding to give my protagonist Fred a father in the police force, which my own was for 17 years, but it also let her have somebody in her family who was closer to the refugees, who was a volunteer in a different capacity at the safe haven, etc. If you can take anything away from this, budding writers, take away that research is not writing, only writing is writing, funnily enough. And it took me 5 years to learn that. And I had to learn that even as someone who's also a literary agent.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
frequently asks my authors, like, how's that manuscript going? Any of them were to say to me, oh, I've done another year of research, I'd be like, cool. What about the writing? Because it was myself, I can't take my own medicine. So there you go.
There you go. Now, we're going to get back onto tips for writers a little bit later. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you about the title. Tell me a little bit more about it. Who came up with the title?
Not me. I suck at titles. I am horrendous at titles, and all my authors know this as well. The title was a brainchild of my fabulous editor, Kate Stevens. I had called it Operation Safe Haven as a working title, and she said that sounds like a mystery. But the motif of maps and geography was always in there, particularly because very early on, in trying to wrap my head around the Kosovo War and having to research the history nerd that I am, having to research that area of the Balkans and what the Balkans were going through with various wars and civil wars, etc., from World War II right up until the 90s, it occurred to me that it's all a little bit bonkers and really hard to keep track of, because it ultimately comes down to arbitrary lines and men making decisions about where lines are on a map, which is often how wars get started and ended as well. So very early on, trying to grapple with the history of Kosovo and the Kosovo War and Kosovo and Serbia, I realized that it was all kind of arbitrary, and that is a wonderful metaphor as well for growing up and these shifting sands underneath our feet that tell us you're a child one day and a young adult the next. So very early on, I kind of made sense of the whole story and the history behind the story through geography. And Kate saw that and she gave me a list of titles, and I think we both got goosebumps for the year the maps changed. And it is, I cannot tell you the number of people who love the title.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how they feel about the book. If nothing else, I have a great title and a beautiful cover by the wonderful Astrid Hicks as well. But yeah, I like to say I kind of loosened the jar for Kate, in that I had the motif of maps and geography, but she was the genius who came up with the title for sure, because I suck at them.
Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, you're an advocate for Australian young adult fiction and have been heavily involved in the LoveOZYA movement. Can you tell me how this started and how do you think things have changed since?
Well, it started in 2015 when the Australian Library and Information Association started releasing lists of the top 10 most borrowed books. And I'll put a proviso on that and say this was the most borrowed books from public libraries. There's no cohesive way to get all of the individual primary and high schools to reveal their lists, obviously, because we have public schools, private schools, religious schools, etc. It's just there's no one body to collate all of that information. So this is just public libraries. And there were 4 categories. There was adult fiction, adult nonfiction, children's books, and young adult literature. And in all but one of those categories, it was an even split of the top 10 most borrowed titles being 5 Australian and 5 by international authors, except on the young adult list. On the young adult list, we only had 2 Australian authors represented, the fabulous Ali Marnie and Marcus Zusak. All the other books on the young adult list were kind of what you'd expect in the year 2015. It was The Hunger Games, it was Divergent, it was the Maze Runner series. It was basically every American book that had been turned into a big blockbuster television show or film. And a bunch of us who are huge Aussie YA supporters, we were then and we still are now, kind of noticed that trend. And it was kind of a solidification of what we'd seen anecdotally in the marketplace as well, which was bookshelves being overrun with film tie-in editions and television tie-in editions. And this feeling of, this was also the time of like John Green and the kind of epicenter of his adaptations with The Fault in Our Stars, etc. And all of his books were being optioned for film, and we could just see this onslaught coming. And we kind of decided we had to talk about and tackle it now when we had this launching off point through the Library Association, an example of what we were all seeing. So we used that as a launching off point to talk about, hey, we know that American YA literature has big money and big Hollywood money behind it right now. We totally get that. But let's talk about why Australia's youth literature, why the youth literature of any country is really important. So that was our launching off point. I was thrilled to be involved in one of the first meetings and organisations discussions. And from that first discussion, we decided to create an organisation called LoveOZYA, which is still going on today. I was thrilled to be one of the chairs of that organisation. The organisation is now going full steam with a whole new committee, and it's doing wonderful, wonderful things, particularly in the time of COVID-19. They are a rallying cry around supporting local Aussie YA authors, and it's just incredible. But yeah, it was designed originally just to be heard above the roar of Hollywood and how much money and promotion was being thrown behind American young adult titles, to the point that Australian creators were really being forgotten by young readers.
Now, reading about your journey in preparation for this interview, I was intrigued to learn that you wrote fan fiction for a while and credited it to
Yeah.
helping you find your voice. So, for those who don't know what fan fiction is, can you tell me a little bit more about it and why you think it helped you on your writing journey?
Fan fiction is, as it suggests, fans playing in universes and with characters who are not their own. So the big one lately has been, for a long time, has been Harry Potter fan fiction. Kids making stories based in the world of Hogwarts and the world that J.K. Rowling created, but obviously they do not have any ownership over those properties. They are just fans playing in those worlds and playing with those characters. I did this from the ages of 15 to 24, and I think I wrote all up 391,000 words of fan fiction for various different properties. I was very big into Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan fiction. There was some Twilight in there. There was some West Wing. There was a television show from America called Once and Again, which I was also a huge fan of. I had an eclectic mix of fan fiction, and it was the first time that I had shared my writing creatively. I mean, it gave me an avenue to actually write. I was inspired to write by these shows that I loved and some storylines that I thought needed improving. Um, which I also think is the first hint that you might be a writer is if you read or watch something and you think, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. Let me just tinker with that. Stephanie Meyer, J.K. Rowling, Aaron Sorkin. Let me just tinker and make it better for you. That if you think that, you might be a writer. To have that kind of ego on you and say, I would do it this way. Let me just show you how, Aaron Sorkin, is hugely egotistical. But it was, I was just playing in those realms, and it was the first time that I had written creatively and for a prolonged period of time. So it kind of taught me that I could write a story from beginning to end, even as I had to relearn that writing The Year the Maps Changed over 5 years. There were instances where I wrote short stories, completed them in a day, and like it was finalizing a project. What I considered a project was really fulfilling for me. And the stuff that I was writing, I was gravitating towards coming of age stories and the younger characters in stories. So that kind of was giving me hints of the themes that I was gravitating towards as well. And it was also the first time that I was getting feedback. Not always great or encouraging feedback from strangers on the internet, but to actually put your creative self out there and expect people to blast you and criticize you, that takes courage. And little 15-year-old me tipping her toes into that world, I'm surprised that I was that brave, because I was a really shy kid and I really got nervous when I had to do creative writing in class, and the thought of my teacher reading it would make me break out in a blush. So for me to go and share my work with strangers on the internet who, like I said, I had seen them being cruel to others, but actually majority of them were really encouraging of what I was writing. And they could see what I was doing. They could see the stuff that I was gravitating towards, and they'd give me hints and tips about my spelling and grammar in particular. But for the most part, people in fan fiction realms are really encouraging, and they seem to know that it is an endeavor largely undertaken by younger kids, which is very true, and that it's younger kids kind of figuring themselves out through the stories that they are brave enough to start telling, which I was hugely grateful for. So absolutely, that was how I found my voice. And I think that's how most creatives dabble in their creative pursuit originally, is by mimicking and imitation. And people like Zadie Smith have said that this is completely the way to do it. I mean, she says the way that you learn piano is by mimicking and repetition. You're basically doing the same thing in fan fiction. So I completely credit the likes of Twilight and The West Wing and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek with giving me my start. But it was mostly about giving me the courage to actually put ideas down on paper.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a little bit about your work as a literary agent, but given your industry experience from these two very opposite ends of the publishing spectrum, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give to aspiring writers out there?
So the advice I've already given is to actually write.
Yeah, right. Yeah, got that.
Definitely right. But I mean, having said that, I also say read widely. I went off and I studied RMIT professional writing and editing. And there was the component of that where you had to work on a novel. And the novel that I was working on for RMIT was a werewolf romance because that's what I was reading.
Yeah.
I had just finished Twilight, was completely consumed by Twilight. From Twilight, I found the Charlene Harris Sookie Stackhouse True Blood series. And then I found Patricia Briggs and Ilana Andrews and just a whole lot of paranormal romance. And that's all that I was reading and writing. Turns out, because I was reading so much of it, that's all I could think to write was a werewolf romance. Obviously, from where I'm standing now in the year 2020, having written a historic middle grade fiction novel that's quite, I would say, a bit of a family saga as well. Obviously, werewolf stories were not where my heart lies, but because I was reading, that's all that I was reading. I was completely consumed by it.
Yeah.
I was somebody who needed to be told to read more widely. And I think I started to towards the end of that program. I think when I was handed a few Sonia Hartnett books to read and study for the RMIT component of professional writing and editing.
Yeah.
Once I started reading like Sonia Hartnett and getting hooked by her story, that opened my mind up and I realized I was reading a little bit too myopically and I was reading way too much in one genre and for one adult readership. I had to go more broad. So I did. I started reading adult nonfiction. I started reading contemporary romance. I started reading more young adult literature. I started reading poetry. And I'd also say film and television also does this. It kind of triggers in your brain a mind for dialogue. And television series in particular, now that we're in the culture of binging them, you can really see a character arc forming. And that's all working away in the back of your mind. You may not realize it actively, but all of this stuff that you're absorbing is teaching you something about story, about character, about plot. So I would say if you're only feeding your brain one type of story, it's going to come out in a way that is repetitive, that is derivative. You have to kind of feed your brain more stuff. You got to shove more stuff in there and just see what sticks. So I would say from reading poetry, I learned the power of sparse prose. Sparse prose. It's a
Yes.
wonderful combination of words. And it was something that I had to remind myself because, of course, I knew that short sentences are more powerful and pack a punch. And I knew that from when I'd studied journalism. And one of my lecturers said to me, Jesus wept. You don't need purple prose around tracks of tears down his cheeks. You just need Jesus wept. 2 words gets the point across so quickly. And poetry reminded me of that. Anna Akhmatova, who's one of my favorite poets of all time, a beautiful Russian poet, reading her reminded me that, yeah, the less you say, the more room you're giving your reader to feel. That is amazing. So from Anna Akhmatova, you will hear thunder and remember me. That's just goosebump inducing.
Yeah.
So I would say read widely. If you think that you are somebody who only wants to write YA rom-com, don't just read YA rom-coms because I can promise you're going to send yourself balmy comparing yourself to those authors and their books and their finished products for one thing, but you're also going to find yourself, whether you mean to or not, being a little bit repetitive and derivative of those authors. So go off and explore all different types of art form and just feed your soul a little bit with different stuff and just see what sticks and realize that you're giving yourself tools to then take away and tap into them as you need them as you're writing. Number one would be, if you want to be a writer, you have to actually write, which I'm sure is something that Neil Gaiman and Stephen King have also said brilliantly elsewhere, but also to read widely.
So, Danielle, what's next? Are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes. So when Hachette bought The Year the Maps Changed, I also pitched them a really basic idea for a young adult standalone novel that I had. And they said, cool, we'll have that as well. So they bought that from me. And on about March 11 or 15, I had to hand in the first draft, and my editor, Kate, again, hi, said, oh, wow, well done doing that during this time, especially. But she kind of said, I really love this story. So the idea that I pitched them for my second novel is definitely greenlit and going through. I'm now currently in the stage of doing the structural edit on it. It is, I don't have a title for you because much like Operation Safe Haven, my editor, the first thing that she said was, do you love the title that you've given it? Which the way she said it it was clear she hated the title. So I was like, no, not at all attached. I know it's rubbish, even though secretly I thought it was quite good. So it's currently an untitled young adult novel. It's contemporary again. There's a lot of family drama in there again. It is set entirely, and for a very important few reasons, in Hobart. So I got to go to Hobart last year before everything happened. In December last year, I got to go to Hobart and do some walking around and some studying and some inspiration. Love Hobart. It's going to be a story about a fictional family of thespians. So there's also a fair bit of fictional Australian film and theatre history in there, which surprisingly has let me talk about the importance of Australian arts culture and why it's important for Australians to tell their own stories and have a place on the world landscape. I'm really excited about it. There's romance in there, and I'm currently at the point of going back. Yeah, it's for older kids, so it's not another Maps change where it's for, you know, that 10 to 14 age group. It's definitely for the older end of YA, but I'm probably very much reacting to writing it in the here and now, because there's lots of touching of faces and a lot of hand holding and a lot of hugging, and I don't care. I do not care. Let them hug it out now while they still can. Also because I've set the book in 2019, in October 2019. So these poor fools have no idea what's coming. And I just say, kiss each other senseless. Go for it. So yeah, I'm currently working on it. The original plan was to have it out in 2021, but I truly don't know what's happening with that. If there's a few books being postponed until 2021, it will probably shift those of us who are going to have tentative release dates that year into 2022, but who knows?
So, Danielle, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
DanielleBinks.com, and that's BINKS. All my channels are up there, but I'm also DBinks over at Instagram and Danielle_Binks at Twitter.
Danielle, it's been fabulous chatting with you today. I wanted to wish you every success with this beautiful book. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Book.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that you stay safe and well, and I hope your listeners do too. And I really appreciate getting to talk to another human being.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudineteinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.